Hello everyone, this is Bhushan back again with another video. In this video, we will discuss one of the Java interview question, that is how to reverse a given string. If the user gives an input like b bytes, then we should expect the output like this, the reverse of a given string. And we have to solve this problem without using a reverse method. The question is, how do we solve this? The most common way of reversing a string is, we will create a temporary variable and will assign an empty string. And now we will take the last character from an input string and concatenate it to a temporary variable. Now the temporary variable contains the string yes. And now we will repeat the same process. This time we will take the last second character, which is e, and concatenate it to a temporary variable. Remember, this time the temporary variable already contains the string yes. For that we will concatenate a character e. Now the temporary variable contains the string yes e, and we will repeat the same process. This time we will take the last third character and concatenate it to a temporary variable. Now the temporary variable contains the string set, and now we will take the last fourth character, which is nothing but a y, and concatenate it to a temporary variable. Now the temporary variable contains the string sety, and we will repeat the same process for all the characters. Once the process is completed, if we print the temporary variable, we should expect the output, which is reverse of a given string. This is the most common way of reversing a string, and everyone follow this approach. But this is not a good way of reversing a string. Why? What is the problem with this approach? The problem is unnecessarily we are creating a n number of objects just to reverse a string. How? Let's prove that. Before that, let's remember 2 points. In Java, string is an immutable class, and if we make any changes on a string object, that will create a new object. Remember these 2 points and move on. At the beginning, we will create an empty string and we will assign it to a temporary variable. Now the temporary variable is pointing to a empty string object. Now what we will do is, we will take the last character from an input string and concatenate it to a temporary variable. That will create a new object and we will assign it to a temporary variable. Now the temporary variable is pointing to a newly created object. The previous object will become eligible for garbage collection, and we will repeat the same process. The next time we will concatenate the last second character, which is e, to a temporary variable. That will create a new object and we will assign it to a temporary variable. Now the temporary variable is pointing to a newly created object, and the previous object will becomes eligible for garbage collection, and we will repeat the same process. This time we will concatenate the character t to a temporary variable. That will create a new object and will assign it to a temporary variable. Now the temporary variable is pointing to a newly created object, and the previous object becomes eligible for garbage collection. This process goes on for every character. At last we will take the first character and concatenate it to a temporary variable. That will create a new object and will assign it to a temporary variable. Now the temporary variable is pointing to a newly created object, and the previous object will becomes eligible for garbage collection. And if we print the temporary variable, that will gives the reverse of a given string. As you can see, just to reverse a string, we have created a number of objects. This is not a good way of reversing a string. Then what is the good way of reversing a string? So the best way of reversing a string is, we will convert the string to a character array using a 2-char array. That will give us a character array. Now I will create a 2 variables, first and last. The first, which is pointing to a 0th index or a first character, and the last variable, which is pointing to a last character or a 7th index. If you observe something, the first is less than last. So this is the condition. If this condition becomes true, then we will swap the 2 characters. That is, first character with the last character and the last character with the first character. So we have modified the existing array. Remember, we are not creating any string objects. We are just swapping the characters inside the existing array. Once the swapping is over, we will increment the first by 1 and decrement the last by 1. So now the first, which is pointing to a second character or a first index, and the last, which is pointing to a 6th index or a last second character. Again the condition becomes true, which is first is less than last. And again we will swap the two characters, that is first index with the sixth index and the sixth index with the first index. Again we have modified the character array. Again we will increment the first and decrement the last. Now the first, which is pointing to a second index, and the last, which is pointing to a fifth index. Again the condition becomes true, that is first less than last. And again we will swap the two characters, that is second index with the fifth index and the fifth index with the second index. And again we have modified the existing array. Again we will increment the first and decrement the last. Now the first, which is pointing to a third index, and the last, which is pointing to a fourth index. And again the condition becomes true, that is first is less than last. Again we will swap the two characters, that is third index with the fourth index and the fourth index with the third index. And again we have modified the existing array. And now we will increment the first and decrement the last. Now the first, which is pointing to a fourth index, and last, which is pointing to a third index. This time the condition becomes false because the first is greater than last. So the condition becomes false and we will stop the process. Now if we print a character array, we will get the reversed character array. Now we have to convert that character array to a string object. That's very simple. We will pass that character array to a string constructor that will give us a result, that is reverse of a given string. This is the best way of reversing a string. Remember, in this approach we are not creating a string object more than once. So this is the best way of reversing a string. Now I will directly jump into Eclipse IDE and I will write this program and I will show you practically. Let's get started. I'm in Eclipse IDE and I have created a project called YouTube, and also I have created a class called string reverse. And inside the class I have created a method called a reverse string. And what I will do is, from main method I will pass a input string to this method, and this method will return the reversed string. Okay, let's write our logic. First I have to create two variables, that is first and last. Int first, which is always pointing to a first character, which is 0th index. And the second variable is int last is equal to, I cannot write 7 directly because in this case the last is pointing to a 7th index, but if the user passes some other input, then we have to find that. So what I will do is I will write something like this, string dot length. So if I write like this, then I may get an exception like array index out of bound exception, because string dot length gives the length of the input string. In this case the length of the b bytes is 8. So now the last is pointing to a 8th index, but in this case there is no index called 8, so we will get an exception array index out of bound. So what I will do is I will write length minus 1. Now string dot length gives 8 and 8 minus 1 7. So now the last, which is pointing to a 7th index. So now we don't get any exceptions. So let's move on. I will write a for loop, and first is equal to 0, first is less than last, and I have to increment first, in the same time I have to decrement last. And inside the for loop we have forgotten one more thing, that is we have to convert the string to a character array. Let's do that. String to char array, and I will store it in a character array. Inside the for loop, let's swap the characters. First of all, let's create a temporary variable which is of type character, char temp, and c of first, and c of first is equal to c of last, and c of last is equal to temp. This is a simple swapping technique. I hope you already know that what is happening. If not, don't worry, let me explain. And after completing the for loop, I have to pass this character array to a string constructor. Let's do that. New string. For that we will pass character array. Save this and right click, run as Java application. As you can see, the string is reversed. Let's pass one more input. Let's say I will pass hello world. Save this, right click, run as Java application. There you go. Let's debug this Java program and see what is happening. I hope you already know how to debug the Java programs. I will put a breakpoint here and I will click on debug as Java application. Click on no. From main method we are passing an input string called b bytes. Inside the method we are accepting the input string, that is b bytes, and I will convert the input string b bytes to a character array. Now the character array contains b bytes, which is an array, and I will create a variable first, and which is pointing to a 0th index, and I will create a variable last, which is pointing to a 7th index. String dot length gives the length of the b bytes, which is 8, and 8 minus 1 7. That's why the last is pointing to a 7th index, which is s. And inside the for loop, what I will do is I will create a temporary variable and c of first, which is pointing to a 0th index, in this case b. I will store the character b into a temporary variable. As you can see, the temp is contains the character b. Next, what I will do is I will assign the c of last, which means the 7th index, in this case, which is pointing to a character s. I will assign the character s to a first index or 0th index. As you can see in the character array, the 0th index, previously it was b, now it is replaced with the last character, which is s. Now what I will do is I have to replace the last character, which is s, with the character b. I have already stored the character b inside the temporary variable. I will assign the temp variable to a last index, which is 7th index. As you can see, now the first index, which is pointing to a s, and the last index, which is pointing to a b. So we have swapped the characters. As you can see, previously the first, which is pointing to a 0th index, and last, which is pointing to a 7th index. Now once the first iteration over, we have to increment the first variable and decrement the last variable. That we are doing here. Now if I see the first, which is pointing to a first index, and now the last index, which is pointing to a 6th index, again the process goes on. This process will goes on till this condition becomes false. So at last we will pass the character array. As you can see, all the characters are swapped. Now we will pass the character array to a string constructor. That will gives the output. That's all about this video. I hope you learned something out of this video. Thank you so much for watching. I will see you in next video.